Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am I'm your host today. I'm Ashley. You recognize my voice by now. I'm here with Dougald Hine, who has agreed to co-host with me. Dougald introduced me to Adam Greenfield, and we're going to talk a little bit about one of Adam's projects called Lifehouses. So first I'll have Dougald explain, sort of the backstory, how he came across this project, and then I'll have him toss it over to Adam to introduce himself. So welcome. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really good to be back, Ashley. This is exciting, being a co-host here for the first time. Well, I mean, Adam and I, we can probably dig into this later. We had crossed paths a little bit further back in time through I guess a shared interest in Ivan Illich.
Yeah.
But how we ended up having this conversation today is that a few weeks ago, you wrote something, Adam, about this idea of lifehouses. And several different people forwarded that piece to me and said, this sounds like something that really crosses paths with stuff you've been thinking about and talking about and working with. And I read it and I felt that in a really deep way, because you were talking in the piece about this question of places of worship, churches and chapels primarily, over 50,000 of them in the UK, many of them increasingly sitting empty. What happens to them? What role do they play? What role could they play within our communities? And you were asking this in a very pragmatic way from a kind of perspective that had a lot in common with the kind of questions I've been thinking and talking about for years with Dark Mountain. But also, I mean, it's not necessarily known to everyone who's followed Dark Mountain, but in 2009, the same year that Paul and I published the manifesto and launched that project, I also founded an organization called Space Makers that grew out of a meetup that I was running in London for anyone who was interested in reusing and reimagining space that was being underused or overlooked within cities. And that's still going. It's an agency these days run by my good friend Matt Weston. And so I feel like sort of both sides of this, both the kind of rethinking buildings and the how do we get real about the depth of the trouble we're in and the things worth doing in the face of it, have been so central to my work. And then there's the minor detail that I grew up around churches. And literally, we're recording this on a Friday at the end of April. Last Sunday, so 5 days ago, my dad had the closing service at the church that he's been very active in his retirement, that is now closing down because the congregation has become too small and too elderly to carry the weight of the responsibility of this old building any longer. And so it just all feels very close to home for me. And I'm kind of keen, as someone who moves between worlds, to see what I can do to spark some conversations with different groups of people that might pick up on something that it felt like you'd woven together in a really kind of in a way that was getting people's attention in what you wrote in this piece. So Adam, maybe if you could kind of talk us through how you ended up writing this piece about Lifehouses and tell us a bit more about what's in it.
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, the fundamental idea is about repurposing spaces which are going unloved and are at risk in the decline of their congregations of falling into disrepair and disuse, and might no longer be of active service to the communities around them. And what triggered this concern for me, frankly, was, I was reading The Guardian. I kind of scan The Guardian, the New York Times every day just to keep abreast of what mainstream consensus opinion is shaping itself around. And so I have to assume that his timing was deliberate. Simon Jenkins is a columnist in The Guardian that I don't have much use for. I virtually never agree with anything he has to say, and I find him almost unbearably pompous in the way that he expresses the opinions that I so heartily disagree with. But he caught my attention. There was something about I forget what the headline was, but it was like, let's take these underutilized churches and put them to good use. And I scanned through the piece and I thought, okay, there's something to this. I hate myself for doing so, but now I'm agreeing with Simon Jenkins. He's made me agree with him. Thanks a lot, Simon. And And yet I thought he missed a trick. He was basically starting from this idea that, the profession of Christian faith is in decline in the United Kingdom, that certainly the established church, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is declining more precipitously than most denominations. And that, as you note, there are these 50,000 buildings strewn around the land, each of which was built to last, each of which is at the physical and social heart of its community, each of which could potentially be returned to a place in our affective lives and our if I'm not afraid of the word spiritual, our spiritual lives, the things that we do together to mark the turns of the season, to mark the stages of our lives. I believe that we all have enduring need for those rituals, whether or not they have supernatural or religious content or not. I'm less concerned with. I do think that we also need ways to come together as communities and learn how to get along with one another across dimensions of difference. I think that's really critical to the project of collective survival over the period that we've entered, which I don't think I need to explain to anybody listening to this podcast what the issue is with that. And that was the aspect that I thought Jenkins missed. He didn't really situate, the proposal was kind of abstract. It could have been uttered at any time in the past 30, 40 years. It wasn't really geared to our particular moment in history. And what I had, kind of on the shelf, as it were, waiting for the moment to be appropriate, was a whole set of ideas about just what you would do with a space like that in a time of climate system collapse and earth system collapse. This goes back for me to my involvement in Occupy Sandy. After Superstorm Sandy hit New York City, the place where Occupy Sandy set up its disaster relief recovery distribution hubs was in two churches in Brooklyn. And one of them, 520 Clinton Avenue, was the one that I worked in particularly. And so I saw, with my own eyes and knew with my own body what it was like to do mutual aid-based disaster relief and recovery work in a previously sacralized space. And then on top of that, I folded in a bunch of stuff that just, has cropped up in the course of, 30 or 40 years of my life now of paying attention to apro-tech stuff and convivial technology stuff and anarchist understandings of, Clifford Harper's old visions illustrations. I don't know if people are familiar with those, but ways in which anarchist and self-organized communities could repurpose underutilized spaces. And then finally, my partner's work at our local food hub. And, as listeners may or may not know, there are more food banks and food hubs in the United Kingdom at this point in time than there are bank branches, and times are desperate, and people are falling back on what has so far been offered charitably, and I think could more profitably be offered on a mutual aid model. So that is the fundamental framing. What would you do with an old stone village church in ways that could make it useful to people who are suffering from the impacts of neoliberal austerity and climate system collapse? That's the fundamental proposition.
Dougald, do you want to go ahead?
I was going to say, you talked about so the two little bits to add on to that stuck out for me in the piece. One was this naming of the idea of, what if we reimagine these buildings as life houses? And I feel like that's part of why this has kind of caught people's imagination, is because there's something in that way of naming that speaks to people. And then the other bit is, you were sort of listing out some of the examples of what's going to be needed, what's already needed. And you were talking about infrastructure, and these as kind of spaces that almost can serve as as you saw in Sandy, as the kind of hubs of an emergency level of infrastructure for when the infrastructure that we take for granted is failing us. on the assumption that that's going to become a more and more normal thing in the times ahead.
Yeah, and that should be distributed as well. I mean, I'll just, really quickly explain what I mean by that. Centralized networks are vulnerable to a single point of failure. When you take out the command node or the central place in a centralized network, the whole network falls apart. It delaminates, and the individual nodes of the network can no longer communicate with one another. And decentralized networks, which I think are generally preferable to centralized ones, merely, replicate that structure kind of on down toward the edge of the network. It's a slightly more robust way of thinking of things, but it's still vulnerable to being severed when master nodes in the network are severed from one another. A distributed network has the property that, instead of there being like one central power generation plant and that piping power all over the country, every lifehouse, could in principle generate its own power, generate its own clean water, like filter its own drinking water, and be really robust to the disruption of infrastructural networks that way. I'm really very keen on what you're saying about the magic of naming. I think that, it's not like these ideas haven't been around. I mean, some of the feedback I've gotten since publishing the article has been, well, you pompous bastard, what are you trying to claim credit for? These ideas have been around in the air for ages. I'm like, yes, of course they have. And I'm not trying to take credit or ownership over any of it. I want people to, do what they will in their own community, by their own lights. But the naming of things is crucial. And I think that if it helps a fairly diffuse set of ideas acquire specificity and concreteness in people's mind by calling it a lifehouse, I agree with you. I think that that's the only reason that this is propagating, why this is sort of catching fire in the imagination of people. Because, by hook or by crook, somebody came along and gave it a name that allows it to lodge in people's imagination.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was done.
So, okay, I have a couple of thoughts. One, when you were talking about the infrastructure point, I did some research on Earthships. I don't know if either of you are aware of this technology, but Earthships are this, for our listeners, this form of architecture invented by this guy in New Mexico, Michael Reynolds. And basically the idea is that the building itself is self-sufficient. So it's like at least close to self-sufficient in water. It has its own water sanitation systems, gray water and black water systems, energy, and heating and cooling are kind of like built into this passive solar design of it. I love that. And I did some research with the Earthship builders when they came here to Uruguay and built a hotel near us. And I met all the team, and it's actually like a really small community. Once you've met them, you're kind of like in and you know how it works. And it's like only a few people really who like have stuck through the whole thing. So I did some interviews with them, and it's just so cool. And one of the guys went to Puerto Rico and was doing Earthships like for hurricane resistance and for like, in post-disaster, like these buildings can continue to be self-sufficient. So I love that idea. And then another thing I've been thinking about a ton recently, I just got into Christopher Lasch, who's well known for his Culture of Narcissism book, but he also in a lot of his other writing had similar ideas to like Wendell Berry about I guess looking back toward tradition and re-embracing tradition in some ways, looking to, I don't know, some more self-sufficiency, community resilience, like connection to place. And I think his whole life he was basically trying to like spin his wheels on this vision. And I just have this feeling like maybe now is the historical moment where some of these things come to pass because of I'm like kind of a Marxist, because of the material conditions that we're in, and so I wonder whether or not you have this feeling like we are in a historical moment where these kinds of ideas that have been around, like you mentioned, come to pass. But I'm curious to know what your theory is of how, or either of you, how it plays out, because I know like probably all three of us have done or been around various activities that were like this, and then they kind of bubbled up for a while and then they lost steam. Like, what keeps people showing up potentially? What is the theory here? Like, what moment are we in where like this actually could potentially pick up steam?
So, Dougald, you should probably speak to this from your own perspective, because I'm sure you've got very interesting things to say about this. But in my writing, I'm working on a book at the moment that's called Beyond Hope. And the subtitle is like, collective power and mutual care in the long emergency. And that last bit is important. I do understand the period that we're in now as a long emergency. And what happens typically in mutual aid situations is that there is an inciting event, right? There is some kind of pulse event, some kind of crisis that rouses people to defense of their lives and their communities. And they are willing and able to exert, an arbitrary amount of energy. They'll give everything. There might not be anything left, for them to do. They might not be able to do their job. They might not be able to, the fabric of everyday life might have come undone, but they have all of this energy and heart and presence to give to the effort of recovery and repair. And then typically what we find is that the moment passes, right? Everyday life reasserts itself.
Right.
Institutional structures flood back into the frame. And the urgency just evaporates. And then all of a sudden, there's something almost faintly embarrassing. I mean, I remember the last days of Occupy Sandy, toward, March of the next year. It was like, there's something faintly embarrassing about being back in the distro hub, after everyday life. And there was almost like this evaporative cooling effect, whereby like the last people left there were the people who had nothing better to do. And so what I'm trying to imagine in the book is, how do you maintain that sense of commitment without bureaucratizing? You have to embed these purposes in some kind of structure.
Yep.
In some kind of institution, with ongoing procedures and ongoing ways of doing. But it's fatal for that to become bureaucratized. It's fatal for that to become ossified in habit. And it's not an easy question, right? It's not straightforward. I don't think anybody's ever successfully done it. But there, as you say, the historical moment that we're in, there are material conditions, there are enabling conditions. And what I've gotten out of my participation in these moments personally, this is something I'm always at pains to point out. In the week before Superstorm Sandy hit New York, I was about as privileged as it's possible to be in Western culture. I mean, I had a good role in a good position. I was a published author. There was all this inducements to the ego. I should have liked my life quite a lot. I should have really enjoyed being who I was. If you went, kind of by what the world is telling us that we ought to value. And I didn't. And the moment Occupy Sandy happened, I was reduced to, my first name on a piece of white tape slapped onto my chest. I had no identity. I had no ego. I had no, nothing to my name. I was a pair of hands. And mostly what I did in Occupy Sandy was help move stuff off the back of trucks into church pews and sort it, and prepare it for like going out again. It was the most profoundly gratifying thing that I've done in my adult life. I derive more pleasure and satisfaction from that than any of the other things which are supposedly like, rewarding me for my status in society. And I suspect, life under late capitalism is shit for most of us. It is grueling. It is dehumanizing. It is compartmentalizing. It's degrading. And I suspect it won't take that much the physical and social environment around them. So I think that's probably, part of the answer to the question is it when you do this stuff, it's actually incredibly rewarding and it feels amazing. That was like the dirty secret of Occupy Sandy, was that it felt great.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously you don't want to be deriving, pleasure from a circumstance that's really rooted in great suffering, but there's something to this. But Dougald, I'd really be very curious to hear your thoughts about this, given your experience.
Well, I really enjoyed listening to what you were saying there, Adam, because that sense of there being a kind of a lack of meaning and then an eruption of meaning. I mean, Rebecca Solnit writes about this, obviously, in her book about the sort of remarkable utopias that come into being in the aftermath of disasters. And then this question of like, how do you sustain that beyond the point? I totally recognize that point where it suddenly starts to feel embarrassing, the same thing that felt saturated in meaning, because it's kind of not cool as things reassert their ordinariness and like permanently rupturing the structures of cool. That might be like a big part of what we're really talking about in all of these conversations, I guess. But I remember like one of the places in my adult life that was definitely a lifehouse was when I stumbled into Access Space, this open source media lab in Sheffield, which I walked into in sort of 2005. And at that point, it was already the longest running internet learning center in the UK, because basically the government would fund a series of things that would open up all over the country. 3 years later, the money would run to an end and they would all close down. And there was this little place in Sheffield that was just running on a shoestring using bits of arts funding, but had this extraordinary sense of life in it from the first time I walked into that space, using recycled computers, open source technology, a self-referral approach, which meant that everybody who was in there was there for their own reasons rather than because they were part of a program. And that led me into this kind of network of hacker spaces around the UK and then the rest of Europe. And I remember getting to know some of the people in London who were involved with this stuff. And by the time I arrived on the scene, it was already kind of dying. Saul Albert, who was one of the key sort of instigators and caretakers within those networks, I remember hearing him talk about it and go, why did it work in Berlin and not in London? And his answer was that in Berlin, they created a myth. They created a myth of a giant spaceship that had crashed and was half buried under the city and sticking up in all these different places. And various Berlin landmarks were part of the crashed flying saucer. But also all of their hacker spaces belonged within this mythos. And so he said, whereas in the London group, the London sort of network, they played everything out on the plane of politics. And that was how they dealt with their disagreements. And they all fell out with each other and it went sour and things gradually died. In Berlin, it was like they turned it all into a LARP with this kind of mythic narrative. And you might be seeing where I'm going here, which is, without wanting to offer an explanation of the history of religion that simply says that's all that's going on. One of the things that we might be dealing with if we start getting into a conversation with churches and discovering they're not quite empty yet is that there is within them, or tangled up with them in some way, a history of creating multi-generational spaces, which at their best have been multi-generational spaces of mutual aid. And part of what's interesting, I mean, actually you bringing Lash into the conversation and Wendell Berry and so on is, I think one of the things that is the result of the material circumstances we're in is it throws together people who do and don't have positive relations to tradition in general or specifically. And I feel like that's also part of what's interesting about the invitation you're making with this project, Adam, is because as I've started kind of talking to some of my friends who are more church involved than I am, they go, well, this is really interesting. We'd like to meet this guy. And, this is kind of how we see ourselves already.
Yeah.
That even the language of a lifehouse, I can imagine plenty of churches that would recognize their sense of what matters about what they do in that language, which is just an interesting thing to negotiate around. And the other thing that came back to me was I suddenly had a memory of being, it must be 1998 when the G7 came to Birmingham. And it was kind of at the height of the anti-globalization movement. Reclaim the Streets was really big in the UK. But there was also this thing that was I guess it was the Jubilee debt campaign for cancelling what in those days we used to call third world debt. And so Reclaim the Streets had organized this big Reclaim the Summit thing where they took over a whole stretch of urban motorway in the middle of Birmingham and so on. And I went on a bus from Oxford with some of the most amazing activists I knew, people like Kate Wilson and a guy called, I think he was called Rafe Smythe or something, who was a postgraduate law student who used to go in his vacations and defend people on death row in the States, and pro bono, and he was running Green Action when I arrived at university. And I literally remember coming over this hill with my anarchist friends, and then they caught sight of this human chain, because 50,000 people from Methodist churches and Anglican churches and Quaker meeting houses and so on from around the UK had come on buses to Birmingham to form a human chain around the summit, which was so big that they had to move the summit out of the city and relocate it to a golf course. I remember seeing these amazing, brilliant activists, just seeing their eyes open at all these not terribly political people who had shown up and brought a G7 summit to a halt because their involvement with their churches had taken them to a place of there is something not right with the way that the world is being run, and we need to put our bodies here and say something and do something about it. And so I'm kind of curious, even in its diminished form, the number of people who show up on a Sunday to, or other days of the week, to places of worship in the UK, is vastly larger than lots of the, kind of amazing movements that I've had connections with over the years. And whether in this conversation you're starting, there might be some really interesting encounters that happen around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and no, you're absolutely right. And I promise you that even the most careworn church congregation in my part of London, there are 10 times as many people at services than there are at the anarchist cafe in the Kurdish center. It's something that I'm getting at in the book. I'm trying to make this point to people. I'm an unregenerate, anarcho-socialist, right? I think that's probably the most accurate name for my politics. I'll answer to it. I'll put it that way. And the point that I try to get across to other people who share my politics is that, something like Occupy Sandy, most of the people who do anarchy are not anarchists. Most of us are doing anarchy all the time. This is an argument that Colin Ward was famous for making. Mm-hmm. That most of the way in which certainly working class people, but actually most people get through life is not in compliance with this sort of bureaucratized state formula. We're always on the fiddle in some way. We're always like working things out, sanding things down between the cracks and behind the scenes to make fundamentally unworkable structures work for us. Mm-hmm. And by necessity, that involves people who, the overwhelming majority of people, there were 60,000 volunteers in Occupy Sandy. There may have been 1,000 of them that were like dedicated cadre. The rest of those people are New Yorkers with every stripe of political affiliation under the sun. And, yes, there was a pragma, a local consensus that, this was going to be a space that had certain kind of values running it. If you couldn't sign on to those values, you were probably welcome to leave and do your thing somewhere else. And I think that worked. But, if as, an anarchist and a person of the left, if I couldn't communicate directly, respectfully, openly, honestly, presently with people who do not share my values and beliefs, I don't think I could ever get anything done. The world is not convinced of, my specific set of values, to put it mildly. And, Ashley, we've had some of these conversations before that the conversation that you're convening does gather people from, who might never talk to one another otherwise, who might be suspicious of one another otherwise, who might well be at odds otherwise. And you've identified something that speaks to all of us. And I have to think there's room for more of that.
Yep. Yeah.
As you know, it doesn't mean that you surrender your core values. It doesn't mean that you let go of the things that you regard as core commitments, but you have to be able, where it's possible, to work in coalition with people who might not agree with you at all about other things.
Yep. And I have so many thoughts on this, but I had this big epiphany when I did my dissertation research for my PhD, because I wanted to talk to people who grew food for themselves. Of course, I'm from a city, so I thought I'll talk to city people and community gardens. And I was speaking with a fellow grad student who is grew up rural, and was like, why are you not talking to rural people when you're talking about people growing food for themselves? I was like, I don't know, because I have an urban bias probably. So I included these rural people, and the similarity in answers, it like completely blew open my whole theory about, like, basically I think how positive social change might happen. And it's fundamentally like these dimensions of difference can totally fall away in the service of praxis, in the service of like neighborliness. In my research, it was like I went to this I have this memory, I went to this urban agriculture livestock expo, and it was like so many different people, urban, rural, and there were like people brought goats and like not actual bees, but a beehive to show how it worked, and chickens, like in this agricultural high school on the south side of Chicago, where I'm from. And it was just so cool. People like were just striking up conversations about like, how do you handle the winter? How do you handle pests? And they're just talking about this practical matters. And then I think what you were saying, oh my gosh, I had chills, Adam, when you said I was just a pair of hands. Like, there is something that is so profound about letting go of the ideology and just like your body is a vessel for service. And I think there's something that can really sustain there. But then I'm with Dougald too. Like, part of the doomer optimism conversation is what happens to a lot of us is we go through a period. I'm just gonna like name this because I think it's very funny. I know a lot of people who are like, look back in history, read the collapse of civilizations, the various collapse books, Jared Diamond, Tainter, whatever, and then think like, oh, I'm just an anarcho-primitivist. Like, I guess the whole thing was just all a mistake. Like, maybe language itself was a mistake. You go through this arc, and then you go back, and then you're like, well, maybe it was the printing press. Maybe it was the written word where we really fell from grace. And then you come to a point where you're like, no, I mean, we just live in this society. We live in civilization. I have to make peace with it. I can't like escape from it really if I want to participate at all. And so you kind of make concessions to civilization while also like looking to the past for guidance. And so I think about something like, here's an example. When I read a bunch of anthropology before becoming a mother, and that informed my decision to do like natural childbirth and co-sleeping and extended breastfeeding, which is like Paleolithic in nature. And it's like traditional, like our bodies did this for, hundreds of thousands of years, and it's different what we did in the Neolithic. And that was like helpful to look back to that. And that could fit into modern life for me. I made it happen. And so thinking about like, we end up trying to like recreate traditions. And then, I don't know, in some ways, I would say it's a little hubristic because we think something like, well, what if we just had a space, and Dougald was saying this too, what if we had a space where we spent every one day a week there, and we thought about the seasons and the periods and we celebrated shifts in our life together with the community, and we helped each other, and there was like a myth that kept people coming. It's like, yeah, that exists. It's called religion.
Yeah.
But some people have terrible and have had difficult experiences with those institutions. So the important question is, how do we like move forward, acknowledging all of that, the messiness, and then get back to, I don't know, just make it work in our current lives, you know, where with all of this tradition and all of the best and most sustainable or most meaningful ways in which human beings have organized themselves through human history and before, how do we move forward with that in the world that we currently are in? That's basically the question of the podcast. So not that we can answer that here, but that's the framing I take, at least.
Yeah, it's huge. And I suspect that everybody's going to have a slightly different answer, which complicates things a little bit. Right?
But it's
Like,
good. That's right. That's probably the best way to approach it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that making room for that, you know, a world in which many worlds can exist, is the challenge of our time, if you will. God, that sounds pretentious when I say it like that, but it's true. I keep coming back to this idea of service, right? You said becoming, you know, a vessel of service. And of course, when I was 16 and I was first attracted to anarchist thought, you know, the slogan was non serviam, like I will not serve. And this, I keep turning over and over in my mind the tension between voluntary service and involuntary.
Yep.
That there is nothing more liberating, as you were saying, there's nothing more fulfilling than making yourself, having the space and the freedom to make yourself of service to others. But there is nothing more oppressive than being told that you must serve. And I think that one of the tensions in creating this institutionalized space for coming together is that, you know, on the one hand, you want there to be an incentive for people to participate. And on the other hand, if it ever comes to feel obligatory, I'm the very first person, you know, I don't know if it's like I have oppositional defiant disorder or I'm just, you know, naturally contrarian. You know, I'm the very first person that's gonna be like, you don't get to tell me what to do, you know? So finding that trigger point in each of us where we find something that affirms us, and you don't need to make some kind of incentive calculus. It's just you want to be there, you want to be with these people, you want to be having these conversations. I worry a lot, and I think that it's partially political and discursive, and it's partially socio-technical, and it's you know, probably nutritional for all I know. I worry that we've all become intolerable to one another, and I don't mean, you know, like I don't mean that like we can't agree politically. I mean that almost atomized to the individual level, that like we almost can't form any groups above the level of a dyad anymore. And most of the dyads, you know, most of the couples seem to be in a fair amount of tension as well. Whether it's because we're staring at screens all the time, or we have algorithms like tailor our media consumption to us, or, you know, I hesitate to say that there's one thing. I think there's a lot of things that are contributing to this, and it's sort of multiplicative. But God, if we don't figure out some way to be together with one another over the tension of being intolerable to one another, you know, I just don't know how we make it. I really don't. And as you were pointing out, you know, at moments of great tension, we're temporarily, it seems, able to take those blinders away and see, you know, the things that connect us and the things that need doing, and then we're just a pair of hands. If there's something that needs lifting, you lift. If there's something that needs carrying, you carry. If there's something that needs cleaning, you clean. You know, whatever it should happen to be. But if we can't figure that out, I worry that we just dice the world up into smaller and smaller and smaller capsular little enclaves with no concourse between them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this word that is probably too politically incorrect to be used now, but Peter Sloterdijk talked about the interautistic relations between cells of a phone. And if we can use that word advisedly, if it's still okay to use it, interautistic strikes me as being about what it is that the world is becoming. We are literally idiotic.
I've been, in one way and another for a long time, chasing this sense that we have muscles that we just don't use and that kind of wither, not beyond being capable of being brought back into use, but in ways that leave us kind of crippled. And that a lot of those muscles have to do with the skills of coming together to do things for reasons other than because we've been paid to or told to.
Mm-hmm.
So, the logics of the market and the state are so pervasive that we're like out of practice. We lose the knack of other ways of coming together. And in the next breath, I've always said, and there are pockets where for one reason or another that's surviving. And, it's the hacker spaces and the anarchist squats and the churches and so on that are those pockets where for one reason or another people have stumbled on, reinvented or kept alive traditions of coming together to do things for reasons. And so that's why in a kind of pre-political way, all religious spaces to me have a tendency to be holding something that is a pocket of resistance to the logics of the market and the state, and therefore places where it's possible to get alongside and have some kind of sense of coming alive together in a way that has something in common with your Sandy experience. And as we've been having this conversation, I've been thinking about the Lifehouses I know already, starting to populate this, starting to think of maybe the Lifehouse as a category where some of them are or could be in religious buildings and some of them aren't, but they have a feeling when you walk in there that's actually quite like the feeling that you get when you walk into a sacred space. Like my first time walking into Access Space had that feeling. If I think about the Dougald in Govan in Glasgow, the old boatyard that was taken over by the collective that came out of the Rhodes protests in Scotland, that place has the most amazing atmosphere when you walk in there. And the last time I was there, because I did the first of the book launch events for Work in the Ruins, we did it on a Saturday night in February in this drafty boatyard building in Govan, and we had 100 people in there. And I was talking to some of the core gang at Gargale afterwards. And they were saying, we've been, there's a challenge we're trying to learn how to navigate. And this, I think, might be relevant to, like, getting this right might be relevant to the success of Lifehouses. They said, because we've got an increasing proportion of people who are drawn to our weekly Thursday night things or who are drawn to our events who are relatively privileged, certainly by the standards of the immediate community in Govan, and who are drawn by a hunger for meaning. And that's good because the space is all about meaning. It's a space of belonging. It's a space where we have the experience, like the experience that you describe of what happened as you moved into being part of the response to Sandy. And they said, and then we've got other people who are just hungry. That's the everyday reality of lots of people in our immediate environs. And the challenge is that the people who are hungry for meaning tend to be, like the three of us, highly articulate, confident at expressing themselves, able without necessarily meaning to take up a lot of space. And, the others can easily kind of melt into the background because we've all got lots of programming that tells us how to behave when we encounter people with different kinds of privilege. And so the question is, how do you, and I think like this seems to me like one of the fundamental dances that we need to try and learn how to do together right now in our societies is how to get those for whom the primary issue is a hunger for meaning, and those for whom the primary issue is real hunger or cold or whatever it is, how to create spaces and ways of being together that don't allow the first group to dominate. And part of it has to be doing stuff rather than sitting in a circle talking or having people on stage talking.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Yeah, another thing I worry about is there are a lot of people hungry for meaning who then get caught up with people who exploit that is another thing. Like, you know, I know of a couple of examples that I've been following where somebody comes out and they're just this guru who has the answer for meaning, and it's like all of the same traumas or abuses of that some people have experienced in either like Orthodox tradition or religion, where there's a guru type figure who takes advantage of somebody, and so that's another thing that's really hard to hold in tension. I do feel pretty proud that at least in our little doomer optimism space, everybody argues with me all the time, and nobody says that my word is correct, and I think that's good. You have to model that kind of like friendly convivial disagreement as a way of maintaining that there's not this like ideological hierarchy. But then another thing I've been thinking about as you both were speaking is just explicitly, I think that we are in a historical moment where it was the case maybe in the end of history, the last couple of decades, where people could be atomized because they had enough wealth, basically, that they could outsource all of the needs of life to just third world countries, people making things and shipping them to them, or, hiring people to do the work of daily life. And I do feel like we're probably at a point now where, and I'm like, where explicitly some of the economic or social breakdown forces people into interdependence. And that's part of the reason we're here in Uruguay, it's very common here because of something being too expensive to sort of do completely on your own. Everybody's forced to work together, to rely on one another. And I have this example. There's this library here. It's a children's library. And it basically got created, and it's like I would say it's like a Lifehouse type space. And I like this idea that you're bringing, Dougald, where the Lifehouse is a type. It's a type of space, including it could be possibly churches, like it is those are like, that's part of the model. But this library was created by this couple. The woman is a librarian and a singer, and the man is a like a classical guitar player. And they basically just asked the community, we want to make a children's library, will you all help us? And so we raised funds. We bought a little cabin. And now every weekend, they go there. This is outside of their normal day jobs, and they sing songs for the kids and read books and lend out, and everyone's donating books. And what a cool space where the explicit goal is something practical. We're going to get kids to read. We're going to get them excited about reading. This is what we're doing here. But then there's all of this, like, it's like mycelial connections between the people just from being in the space together, seeing each other every week. And there's something really, really important about that. But I think that, Adam, your point about it being voluntary is really important. This is something, just one other small side note, same thing with something like voluntary poverty. Nobody wants to be told they can't consume X, Y, and Z thing. But if you're choosing it out of a sense of like, feeling like too much consumerism doesn't really fill up that hole, that void, and actually limiting your consumption in some ways makes you stronger and more resilient. It's a very similar dynamic where when you're choosing it, it feels right and good and spiritually fulfilling. When you're not, it feels oppressive and like maybe even abusive.
Yeah, for sure. I think that weirdly enough, for all of its limitations, the horizontalist or anarchist tradition does have some tools that help us, reckon with these ideas. I mean, specifically, you will not find a better community that is set up to prevent the emergence of a guru figure, right? I mean, it's in the name, the horizontalism, right? It like there is a distributed ethos that's imminent to the entire community. That is, we will not permit the emergence of concretizations or crystallizations of power. And I think having that as a guiding value has helped that community tremendously. There are other aspects of it that have probably limited it, but that one, we tend not to have those problems so much in spaces where that is the guiding ethos. So I think it does have things to contribute to this discussion about what draws us to these spaces. In the Lifehouse article, as posted, I talk about this example from the time of Sandy, from C Squat, a squat on the Lower East Side of New York City, and they happened to have, there was something called the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space, and they had a stationary bicycle dynamo generator that they just happened to have as part of their collection. So when Superstorm Sandy hit the city, the power goes down for a week in Lower Manhattan. Nobody has any power. They wheel this bike out onto the sidewalk. They plug it into a bank of battery chargers for people to come charge their phone up. Somebody's always riding the bike. People come to get their phones charged. That's the draw. But then what happens around the table is the informal, the mycelial, the connections that animate the community.
Mm-hmm.
And people wind up coming to the table because they know that's where the people are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
The people are the killer app.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it's the, the ability to charge your phone is sort of the exoteric, and everything underneath that is the real deal. and I think that this is, ultimately the key to the Lifehouse equation, is that there are things that draw the people that have the hunger. And that really is what the space is oriented around, is the material provision of need. And then because people are drawn to that, whether as a user of those services or as a provider of those services or both. I mean, one of the things that my partner sees in the food hub that she works in is, maybe a quarter to a third of the people who volunteer there also use the services, right? And there's no shame in it. There's no sense that this is a corruption or an exploitation of it. This is just, this is truly mutual aid. They're simultaneously providing for their neighbors and taking benefit from that relation. And I think that if you start from the material provision, you get to the psychic and the affective and the hunger for meaning aspects of it. That's my suspicion anyway. And the spaces that I've seen work best are really founded toward the provision. I think everybody knows what's going on sub rosa, but maybe people don't necessarily admit to it right up front. Because that's, again, that's kind of corny, right? We're all suspicious. We're also, we're all hip and cool, and we can't admit to wanting to be around other people, and we can't admit, to wanting to break bread with people over a big table and share stories and listen to songs and sing together. I mean, like, what could possibly be cornier, right? And I think that I wouldn't be surprised that that's some of the friction or the resistance is just simply what late capitalist media have taught us is cool. Fuck that. Let's just be corny together. I have no problem with that. I have absolutely no problem with that. Spending an afternoon making cornbread, having somebody play the guitar badly and singing along to that. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, and I want to let Dougald talk, but I just want to briefly say, I don't really care what form your sincerity takes, but it has to be sincere to be on this podcast. Like, it just can't be nihilism. The whole podcast is just, the only thing we're not is nihilists. You just cannot make that your identity. And so many people do. And I really just can't abide it anymore. The invitation is to sincerity. I understand frustration. I understand, sadness or anger about the way things are. But the invitation here is toward sincerity, toward I don't care if it's corny. Or if it won't be corny to you if you find like the thing that you sincerely vibe with. For some people it's going to be like anarcho solar punk, and for other people it'll be like traditional fiddle music, and you know what I mean? It's fine, whatever it is, but drawn toward this, the I don't know, something meaningfully sincere rather than just leaning into nihilism as an identity. Like that is the project here.
No, well, I applaud. I mean, I think we all know nihilism is armor, right? Nihilism is armor against disappointment. That's all it is. And we need to make it safe for people to have feeling, to affect and be affected.
Yeah, something we talk about a lot at the school here is, creating spaces to which it is wise to bring more of ourselves than would be welcome in most of the spaces that exist within our societies. Because it's not just about creating spaces to which we bring more of ourselves, because frankly, lots of corporations would like to make their workplaces places to which we bring more and more and more of ourselves. And we're very wise in defending ourselves and setting limits on how much of ourselves shows up to those spaces. The trouble is that, between our workplaces and our schools and many of the families that we've grown up in and so on, we end up having very few spaces to which it is wise to bring more of ourselves. And, this all kind of calls back to like third space thinking. And it's like the only social science text that's ever been taken up and turned into a slogan for a multinational chain, when Starbucks took the concept of the third place, which is neither the home nor the workplace, from that wonderful book. I'm going to forget the guy's name, but it's called The Great Good Place is the name of the book. And they literally went, right, we're having that. We're going to rebrand that's going to be our slogan for our cafes as we go around the world, closing down the actual third places in people's communities. But the good news is that you can create a very small pocket of time and space, and it can give people a lot because of what a kind of desert of meaninglessness and not safeness so many of the spaces that we have to spend our time in, if we're operating in late capitalism, alike. So somewhere that, and again, churches know a lot about this, somewhere that you spend an hour or two a week can be the pocket of meaning that is sort of transformational to the overall shape of your life. And at its worst, that becomes simply a kind of therapeutic pocket that keeps you going so that you can be exploited for all the other hours of the week. But you can create those spaces in ways which are also spaces where you can be inquiring together into what else can we be doing during the other hours of the week. And then a relatively small pocket of time and space can seed a lot of stuff.
I just want to sorry, I just want to briefly say, there's this guy named Chris Arnatti. He walks around cities all over the world, in US and Europe, but all over the place. And then he just like writes about what he sees when he walks through places where tourists don't typically walk. And the thing that he keeps finding in the US specifically, and he writes about this all the time, is older people sitting in McDonald's for hours and hours having coffee and talking to each other. And I just want to non-judgmentally say, if you have no other place to do that, what's the most optimistic part of his work, which is very doomery, is that people will find a place to do that, even if it's McDonald's. And that's actually beautiful, like a beautiful part of the human spirit to see. And once you open your eyes to it, you can see it everywhere. But we just recorded a podcast that hasn't released yet. This woman wrote an article about how to make friends, and it was literally like, sit in your front yard, go to a bar in the afternoon and just start talking to people. People want someone to talk to. make chit chat. And it's just so funny sometimes saying these things out loud that are like normal social technologies for, oh no, we lost him. Maybe he'll be back. Normal social technologies for, you know, regular people, or you know, or I mean, I think about my parents' generation. This is not something I would have to tell them to make chit chat or to you know, to interact with people regularly.
We're starting from a low baseline. We're starting from kind of withered muscles. We're starting from the need for kind of remedial exercises for remembering how to be human together, because we've had ways of organizing our societies that have been so successful at teaching us that we're better off apart.
Right.
And so, you know, and there's a kind of usefully humbling quality in that. It has a way of kind of pulling those of us who have been taught to think of ourselves as the people who live closest to the future down to earth, and reminding us that we're actually the most helpless people, the most clueless people, and that's okay. We can start from here because it's where we are.
Yeah, totally. Well, we lost Adam for a moment. Do you have anything that you and I should discuss while we're waiting for him to come back? I feel like I'd be curious to know about this Illich and conviviality. We didn't really touch on that at all in our last podcast. And what is your take on Illich? Is he the scholar we or, you know, the thinker a lot of people are looking to him at the moment?
Well, it's nice because, you know, 20 years ago when I discovered Illich, no one was reading him really. He just died, and like I have a whole collection of Illich books which I got through sort of Abe Books online in about 2003, 4, 5, and they're all stamped of kind of discarded from university libraries, and it gives you this picture of how, you know, there had been a time when no university library was complete without being equipped with a full set of the works of Illich, and by the beginning of this century, those were among the things that could safely be got rid of. So it's great that so many people have been rediscovering Illich from different angles over the last 10 years or more. I mean, so the event that we did where Adam and I crossed paths, it was the Design Museum in London, which is quite a shiny museum, organized this Convivial Tools Day where they had various people who were kind of talking from one angle or another in relation to Illich's work. I remember there was this old guy who was 92. He was the same age that Illich would have been if he was still around, who had known Illich when they were both visiting professors at Penn State in the 80s. And he just told some stories. And then I'd kind of done my sort of keynote about what Illich meant to me and kind of weaving all sorts of connections. And afterwards, this guy, whose name I've forgotten, he came up to me and he said, to me, Illich was very much a person. And he was like, yeah, he was kind of old enough that he wasn't like most of Illich's friends and collaborators who I had met were kind of, you know, younger than him and therefore kind of looking up to him. Whereas this was someone who'd known him as a peer, as a contemporary. I was going, yeah, it's really strange for me to spend a day listening to all of you lot talking about Illich because he's become something else for you. But for me, he was just a human being. So that was, Adam, while you were gone, we were just talking about the Convivial Tools event where you and I first crossed paths.
Yeah. My internet died right when you were talking about the old people in McDonald's, and I was literally hanging on the edge of my seat. I was like, I wanted to hear what they were doing there. It sounds incredibly fun.
Yeah, they just have coffee and they talk to each other, and it's like a cool space because, you know, even in McDonald's, people can find each other and find friendship and relationality. So
that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So like I have this pen from that
Oh.
I flipped it from that meeting. The Illich thing. Yeah, I think they wanted that space to be like a McDonald's where old people would get together and talk. I think that they wanted to provide a long table Ashley, did Dougal mention the institution that had hosted that event?
Yep, briefly, but not
Yeah.
not in depth. You can describe it if you want.
It was, I'm not even sure how to describe it, to be honest. It was like the folly of an architect. It was like, you know, some architect late in life had built himself a compound in a very nice part of London, a very leafy and quiet and reasonably wealthy part of London. And he built this incredibly idiosyncratic cluster of structures. And then the design museum and a partner that I cannot recall hosted this conversation there, and they invited, you know, some really people who have turned out to be important to me in a bunch of ways. I mean, they had, I would say, you know, good instinct for who to be around that table, but they failed. There's this Yiddish term that comes from the tradition of like Jewish summer entertainment resorts in the Catskills. It's a tumbler. And a tumbler was somebody, you know, like basically like working class Jews would come to these resorts in the summertime from all over the Northeast. And they would be, you know, in family groups and clusters, and they didn't know one another real well. And so the tumbler was like a professional icebreaker. It was like a little bit insult comedian, a little bit, you know, storyteller, a little bit matchmaker. There are all these functions folded up, and then the tumbler was like the catalyst, you know, that made community happen. So that by the time people went home from their week or 2 weeks or whatever it was at the resort, there was a real functioning usness there. And I thought that what that event really needed to do was a tumbler. Because I got into great conversations with the people on either side of me, but we didn't have, you know, like I saw you and I thought, wow, that's the Dark Mountain guy. I've been following his work for ages. You know, and then we just sat at opposite ends of the table or whatever, and then it, you know, we never talked until 5 years later.
Yeah, I'm now thinking that what was that term? Is it a tumbler?
Tumbler.
Tummler. Tumbler. Yeah.
Great. I feel like Lifehouses need tumblers as well. Like this is actually a role that you need to kind of sow the seeds of. I will spread that one. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It was surreal. We were staying for like 2 nights in this. It was on the market for £22.5 million or something, that compound of those 4 buildings, and it had won some award. And it was really funny because I ended up there because Ben Vickers, who by that stage he was doing things like the Unmonastery Project in Matera in Italy, and he was working with the Serpentine Gallery. I'd met Ben in 2009 when him and his mates were squatting this enormous townhouse in Mayfair, and they opened it as the Temporary School of Thought. And I came down and gave a talk about Illich at this like epic squat. I wrote about it in the first issue of Dark Mountain, and that was on the front page of one of the London newspapers as the £20.5 million squat. So I was like, oh wow, this is where we've gone in a decade, from like unauthorized, very convivial gatherings in ridiculously expensive empty buildings in London to authorized, somewhat less convivial, although convivially named gatherings in similarly absurdly expensive empty spaces in London. So that was, that's a weird detour.
But I actually feel like this is I had do you guys remember the magazine Adbusters? Did either of you ever read that? I just felt like there was like this sense around that time. I don't know. I was reading it, I guess, in like 2006 through 2012 or 2010 or something. And it was like, oh, look at this. It's like, you know, look at all the fun things we can do. I think they had a manifesto printed in it, the Tear It Down manifesto. And I, at the time, was working for a professor at the University of Chicago, which is famous for this neoliberal economics. So I ripped it out and I photocopied it and put it on the doors of all these economics professors. It was just like this feeling of like doing something. aliveness, and I don't know, like something has in the last, I don't know, decade or so feels like less alive. Although I feel like now it's starting to pick up steam again. One other thing I wanted to mention when you were talking about the Tumblr is another tradition that we could look to that I've always loved, and I did one of these once and it was great. Jeffersonian dinner. Thomas Jefferson. There's a rule for how you do a dinner according to Thomas Jefferson. You can only have 8 to 14 people at one table. Everybody has to be at the same table. You have to have a topic for the evening. It has to be a meal. It can't just be like sitting around at the table. We have to eat together. And everybody has to come with a list of 5 to 7 questions to incorporate into the conversation. You start with everybody telling their story. So a personal reflection, why they're there, or some kind of story to get everybody gets a chance to speak. Let the conversation take you wherever the passion goes. So nobody's like guiding it. We're just letting it play out as it plays out. As the host, you have to ensure that all participants feel welcome and have a chance to talk, but you don't run it like a meeting. You have to, in a smooth way, invite people into the conversation. And then at the end, everybody gets a chance to just sort of reflect on the dinner and go around again. So that's like it's a social technology. I've done one before and it was just lovely. Actually sticking to the rules, because sometimes like the structurelessness things fill that up if you don't have the rules. But if you do have the rules, people kind of think it's fun and funny. And it ended up working out really well when I did a Jeffersonian dinner on the topic of like sustainable urbanism with some colleagues and some friends. And what a great technology. And there's like, people have figured this kind of thing out before. So every time I have the opportunity to get together with people, I try to do at least some version of this. And I think it works. Some kind of these we figured some of these social technologies out before. The Tumblr, the Jeffersonian dinner. There's like the group size that people can kind of wrap their head around. If it's 30 people at a table, it's really hard to talk all together. 8 to 14 seems like the sweet spot. Yeah. Okay, so
I think
sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, just that there are 2 really important things in what you said that I'm making mental note of myself. The idea these are technologies, right? And they can reproduce. They can be reproduced. They can be, learned and elaborated. But the other is that quality you said to invite people in. I think that the invitationality is so crucial. We, particularly in technology, have obsessed for many years over the formal openness of systems. We say, oh, this is open. Anybody can contribute to it. Anybody can be a part of it. There are no barriers to entry. And I think that's insufficient. It's inadequate, right? I mean, that there's an unacknowledged privilege in saying, oh, anybody can come sit down at this table. No, the tyranny of structurelessness is real.
Yeah.
When there are no structures, then as you said before, people like us are going to dominate it. I will talk I will eat up all the space, So if there isn't some regulation there that I voluntarily signed on to, that regulates, at the IWW meetings we used to do, there was like, a kind of agreement that you could only really ask 3 questions in one night, right? Or like speak, just informally, but like pay attention to the number of times that you were speaking. And even that little bit of structure makes places actively invitational for, and this is an aspect of things that I don't think we've spoken to. I think that we are collectively acquiring a much greater sophistication as to the real ambit of neurodiversity. Like we are not all the same. And I don't even mean in the sense that, neurotypical, neurodiverse. I mean that there are an infinite number of ways to show up and be human. There are as many ways to show up and be human as there are human beings. And we're clearly all pretty verbal. There are ways of showing up and participating that have nothing to do with that. And I think that one social technology that I'd like to refine and see adopted more are ways for people to show up as themselves and contribute. That, Jeffersonian dinners for those of us who love to talk, and quieter ways for people who, even that invitationality asks more of them than they're willing or able to offer. And this is like understanding a human community as an ecosystem with a great many different niches, and that they're all equally valuable and key to the smooth functioning of the whole. And I think that, again, traditionally we might have understood this better than we do now, since the kind of Fordist, Taylorist, disciplinary, the imposition of disciplinary grids over our behavior in an attempt to extract value from our bodily conduct. I think that sort of refined us to a place that isn't doing us any good. Are we? I feel like when we got cut off before, I guess you'll edit that out eventually, or
No, we just kept talking, so it's fine. Yeah.
Oh, super.
Yeah.
Groovy.
But maybe we should wrap up with final thoughts, thinking about what, where this Lifehouse concept, where does it go from here? Anything that we haven't discussed that feels like burning that we should have on the record on this podcast?
Well, first, I felt cheated when I thought that I wasn't going to be able to come back to the conversation of just thanking you, for the platform and the space and the opportunity to talk. It's been wonderful. I'm really grateful. So thank you for having me, and Dougald, thank you for facilitating this. Pleasure. And I couldn't possibly be more pleased with the opportunity to talk these ideas through with people with your backgrounds and perspectives.
Aww.
I think that Lifehouse is catching on. I mean, I have 20 years of blogging, and I know what it's like when something goes viral. It doesn't happen very often for me because I express myself in an idiosyncratic way that, it's very rare that things that I write kind of smolder and catch fire in larger groups of people. But this one is. And I think part of that is due to some of the people that Dougald has shared it with, but I think part of that is also, as you say, we're in a historical juncture where the material conditions make something very much like this idea very interesting to a lot of people. And maybe all it needed was the name. So, I will work toward the realization of that vision in whatever capacity I'm afforded, whether it was like at Occupy Sandy, where I'm just like, somebody establishes something like that in my community, and I just show up there and help with the water filtration system or whatever, or if it is, more rhetorical and helping to spread the idea, whatever seems most useful, I'm down for. And I'm just grateful that, that I helped midwife this idea into being.
I keep thinking of the line from Fight Club. It was on the tip of everyone's tongue. All we did was give it a name. Adam, if people are listening to this and it's kind of sparked something for them, should they just drop you a line? What's any suggestions for how to pick up and run with it?
Yeah, I'm easy to get a hold of. So, my blog, which I've recently kind of jump-started back into being after a long interval of not writing on it, is at speedbird.wordpress.com. So, and there's a contact form on there. but I'm also on Mastodon. I'm at social.coop, just at Adam Greenfield, my name, just one word. I'm super easy to get a hold of. But more importantly, people should not think of me as a point on the critical path toward the realization of this. It's like, do it yourself, do it in your own community. You certainly don't need to get my approval or my chop on something. It's the idea is there for people to take with as and permutate as they will. I would love to hear about it, but I'm not like the Lifehouse guy. I won't be publishing $39.95, here's your own Lifehouse kit or anything like that.
That's so funny because that's like exactly what we say about Doomer Optimism all the time. And same thing with like homesteading or homeschooling. Like you're not going to get like a pig kit. You're not going to get that. You have to figure out how to do it on your own place. Like it just doesn't, it is one of those things like the only way out is through. So I love that messaging. And yeah, we'll send us all those links and we'll put them in the episode description. This was lovely. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you, Dougald, for the suggestion. Thank you for co-hosting. Yeah, just smiling this whole conversation. Really, really lovely to talk to you guys.
Groovy, thanks so much. It's awesome. Take care of yourselves, please.
Yeah.
And I look forward to speaking with you again.
Great. All right, we'll be in touch. Bye, guys. Thank you.